Hello, ladies and gents. We're on module A225, Block 3, Decline and Renewal, 1880 to 1914, edited by Robin McKay. On Unit 21, Political Ferment. At the distinguished these strikes was their sheer scale, which can be measured in the total number of working. Lost unrest occur. Several factors converge to create the conditions period of industrial action. In the Unit 17, you explored the economic situation in the UK. You remember that the UK faced greater international competition from other industrialised countries, particularly the USA and Germany, which saw the erosion of competitive advantage the UK had previously enjoyed. The economic recession of 1908 and 09, which had promoted the Liberals to introduce their people's budget with its multi-form tax, also had a negative effect on industry. As the cost of goods increased, wages remained the same, meaning that real wages were falling, hence the demands for higher wages by striking workers. Finally, expanding trade union membership gave unions more clout than ever before, which enabled them to pursue their demands, as you have seen. Trade union membership rose significantly during the 1890s and surpassed 2 million workers by 1900. The figure reached 2.5 million in 1910 and jumped to 4.1 million by 1914, so 2004. These widespread strikes created challenges for United Kingdom's political parties, especially those that claimed to represent workers' interests. For Labour, the strikes called into question the PLP's claims to represent the most effective way to improve conditions for workers. The fact that many employers were prominent Liberals, meanwhile, reinforced the image of the Liberals as the party of the upper middle class rather than of the people. More broadly, the widespread strikes added to the atmosphere of crisis as workers turned to militant, non parliamentary means to pursue their demands, much like the suffrages and the Ulster Volunteers. Liberals responded by passing the Miners' Minimum Wage Act in 1912, which met some of the strikers' demands. Nevertheless, strikes continued throughout 1913 and by 1914 trade unions a triple alliance of miners, railwaymen and transport workers to coordinate a national strike, like the impending conflict in Ireland and the suffragettes' militant campaign. However, these plans were suspended immediately after the United Kingdom's declaration of war against Germany in August 1914. Forget- Competing for the progressive vote. One of the most important historiographical debates regarding these two parties in over is over when Labour overtook the Liberals as the main party on the left. While Liberals had declared clearly won more seats than Labour in 1910, Labour permanently supplanted the Liberals as the largest progressive party in the UK after 1918, with the first Labour government formed in 1924. The immediate cause of the Liberals' decline seemed to be the schism within the Liberal Party in 1916, creating two factions led by Asquith and Lloyd George, respectively. Writing that more broadly had in fact taken place before the war broke out in 1914, but that this was only made apparent in the election of 1918. Ultimately, it is very difficult to prove when precisely this happened, not least because the 8 year gap between the elections of 1910 and 1918 means there's little electoral evidence to track the rise or fall of either party. A number of historians, such as Rose McKibben, 1974, and Keith LeBourne, 1995, favour a class based explanation for the rise of the Labour Party. In their view, the creation of a party representing workers' interests unavoidably won the support of the majority of voters from the working classes. With the extension of the franchise in 1918 and the removal of structural restraints such as the Osborne Judgment, Labour inevitably attracted workers' votes, mainly at expense of the Liberal Party. Historian Martin Pugh has challenged this class-based interpretation on the grounds that millions from the working classes continued to vote for the Conservative Party rather than Labour. In U19, you studied different aspects of working class culture in the late Victorian era. Pugh argues that many working class attitudes and values, such as hostility towards the state and suspicion of improving legislation, enthusiasm for the monarchy, the empire, and the union with Ireland, were inherently conservative, intended to translate into working class votes for Conservative rather than Labour candidates. Pugh, 2002. While Labour's electoral success later in the 20th century were made possible by greater numbers of working class voters supporting the party, it is important to remember that workers did not automatically or unanimously vote for Labour. Despite its stated aims of representing working class interests, indeed, on the eve of the First World War, many leaving Labour MPs feared for the party's future. Keir Hardy lamented that the Labour Party had seized the count, while fellow MP Philip Snowden, 1864 to 1937, observed that the present Labour representation in Parliament is there mainly by the goodwill of the Liberals, and it will disappear when that goodwill is turned into active resentment. Quoted in Brown, while Labour's fortunes improved dramatically at the First World War, there was nothing inevitable about the replacement of the Liberal by Labour, rather than focusing on the relative weakness of either the Liberal or the Labour Party. E. H. Green has instead argued that it was the Conservative Party that found itself in the least inviolable position on the eve of the First World War. Having lost three elections in a row, there seemed to be little the Tories could do to overcome the Progressive Alliance that kept them out of the power. Now, between 1911 and 1914, the Conservatives and their new leader, Andrew Bonar Law, were drawn towards extremes of speech and action, particularly over Home Rule, was an eloquent and in turn spoke volumes for the way in which their opponents had thwarted them at every turn. It was not until after the Great War, when the Liberal Party and the Progressive and the whole shape of British politics changed by letting the Conservative Party escape from its First World War. It is also important that the different crises that were challenging the Liberal consensus of the late 19th century had answers, while Asquith's cabinet sympathetic to extending their franchise to women in the Progressive Alliance with Labour, which might have effectively resolved these changes. The fact that the Conservatives were looking to vote with and the Labour Party had come to power, while the Liberals would never again form a government in their own right. James Vernon stars his influential book, Distant Strangers, How Britain Became Modern, with this observation. A profoundly new and modern social conditions emerged in Britain between the middle of the 18th and the end of the 19th centuries. The rapid expansion of the population and its increasing mobility over ever greater distances created a society of strangers. This raised a series of problems for the conduct of economic, political, and social life. Old forms of authority, association, and exchange, local relations were increasingly inadequate or impossible. They were slowly displaced by increasingly abstract and bureaucratic ways of making economic, social, and political relations between distant strangers possible. In this passage, Vernon highlights the political, economic, social, and technological changes that have been central to this module, and argues that they have changed the ways the British people related to each other, that a country become, in his evocative phrase, that you have already encountered in the unit urbanisation, degeneration, and understanding of the big city. The unit will examine a number of ways in which people cope with this change, highlighting some of the intellectual and cultural, and so abstract rather than bureaucratic, ways that they made sense of the emerging modern world. We'll look at new ways of studying and understanding the past that developed in this period, what we might call a growing historical consensus. We'll examine the use of history to reinforce ideas of national identity, which was discussed in the unit Imagine Nations Made Real. Finally, we'll explore the ways in which writers of fiction used image futures to explore contemporary hopes and fears. The notion of progress, which is reaching a high point at the end of the 19th century, gave some people certain comfort when thinking about the past and hope about the future. At the same time, however, looking forward and light in their future in order to past and imagine their future in order to understand the momentous period they lived in. It is followed by an online conclusion to the module as a whole, which looks at the long 19th century from the perspective of historians today. A growing sense of the past. Later 19th century was a period of rapid change in politics, the economy, society, culture, and technology, which you examined throughout Block 3. If we compare this period with that, if we compare this period with that between 17th century and the period 1880 to 1914 were turbulent and dynamic times. You may remember uncertainty, new forms of knowledge, that a number of influential currents of thought emerged in the period of 1789 to 1804. In response to the uncertainty produced by rapid change. Both periods featured economic and social schisms and dilemmas. Both witnessed new ways of looking at economic, society, politics, and religion. In both periods, a consensus of national identity developed rapidly across England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. However, towards the end of the 19th century, people were acutely aware that they were living through a period of great change and become interested in recording the past before it disappeared forever. With the end of the century in sight, there was a wide interest in studying and recording history in order to understand what had happened and how the United Kingdom had changed. Perhaps for the first time, there also existed the resources and inclination to carry out research in the past, and an appetite for the cultural products that reflected on that past. Let's consider this development by looking at the three areas: higher education, the writing of popular history, and emerging disciplines. For investigating the past, such as archaeology, in all for the post 1880 period than for any previous time. Higher in history in higher education. One important area where we can identify a growing interest in the past is higher education, which saw a number of changes in the study, practice, and organisation of the disciplines of history. History found a firmer footing in universities and was increasingly professionalised. In 1870s, specifically history degrees were established in Oxford and Cambridge, the Scottish universities and the civic universities such as Leeds, Liverpool and Sheffield. Canada in 2008, new higher education institutions were founded. For instance, in 1895, the London School of Economics, which promoted new types of history such as social and economic history. History in universities were often associated with a search for a national past. As I will explore in section 22.2, for example, and at Edinburgh University, the Sir William Fraser Chair of Scottish History was established in 1901. While in 1909, University College Dublin established a professorship of early Irish history, which was held by the famous nationalist historian Ewan MacNeill. There were new ideas about how to practice history. Prominent historians promoted the gathering and analysis of data from archives, which they describe as scientific history. The Regius Professor of History in Cambridge, J.B. Berry, 1861 to 1927, titled his inaugural lecture in 1903, History as Principles and Objectives. Why do editors think there